Awesome. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Again, today is going to be more of a conversation-based webinar between Kelsie and myself around VPATs, and in particular, what kind of conversations and how to frame conversations around when you have a VPAT that isn't necessarily perfect, perfect in air quotes, um, but essentially just meaning not every category and success criteria is listed as supports. So get us started, we do have a few bullet points here, but as I mentioned before beginning the recording, if anyone has additional questions that come up, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A or the chat. I'll be monitoring both. Additionally, we do have our normal Q&A at the end for any general accessibility questions. Doesn't have to be about VPATs. So, all right, to kick it off, Kelsie, I know you work with a lot of clients around building their VPAT and remediating their VPAT and delivering the VPAT. So first thing on the docket here is to talk about how to answer or how should clients be working on answering the question if any of their potential clients or customers ask, why isn't your VPAT perfect?
Sure. Yeah, that's definitely a common question that we get. And the reason it's so common is because most of the time, most VPATs are not perfect. Most of the time, especially if you're early on in your accessibility journey, your VPAT's not going to be perfect. Or it's not going to have everything fully conforming to the web content accessibility guidelines. When you're reading a VPAT, there's four possible ways that criterion can be evaluated. It can be supports, which is, the what we're aiming for typically. That means that the product meets that particular requirement of the web content accessibility guidelines. Non-applicable might mean that criteria is not applicable to the content. We most commonly see that around things like, hey, the requirements around captions don't make sense if your website doesn't have any videos on it. That's not a requirement that is applicable in that case. And it's useful to let users or stakeholders know that it's not that you have videos that are fully captioned, it's that there's no videos at all. And then the other two are where we're talking about the imperfection of a VPAT is when it's either partially supports or does not support. And so when we have partially supports and does not support on a VPAT, that does mean that the product does not fully conform to that particular requirement. And that's really, really common. So that's one thing to keep in mind and can be helpful for framing those conversations is that it's pretty common for VPATs to be imperfect. In fact, if you go out and look at, big name players in different industries that make their VPATs publicly available, it's very common to see that they've got documented issues in those reports. Which, ideally we don't want imperfect things in the VPAT, but having a level of detail that shows that the VPATs are accurate and transparent is useful to know. And the other thing I really recommend doing if you're presenting a VPAT that shows that there are areas where the product or the website is not fully conforming, whether presenting to leadership or to customers or clients, is to frame that conversation proactively. I'm a big fan of focusing on the positives. And how you talk about that can vary depending on kind of what the sources of those issues are. So typically, I really recommending recognizing that, hey, there's some areas where we know we need to work and identifying here's what we're doing in order to address those areas. So if it's content that's under your control, what does that timeline or roadmap look like for when you or how like we know this is an issue. We're planning to address this on our next product update cycle. We know this is an issue. We are planning to have this addressed within the next 6 months or within the next year, depending on the lift. And having kind of that clear plan, it's definitely better to not act like you're surprised by your own VPAT, like, oh yeah, we've got this issue, we're not doing anything about it, or I know this was here. And other things to bring up can also be ways that you are incorporating accessibility into your process to help prevent issues from getting into the final product in the first place. If you've been to other webinars, you've probably heard us talk about the shift left strategy of including accessibility earlier and more often in your production lifecycle. And that can also be a great kind of constructive area to talk about to help frame the VPAT. Because VPATs at their core are a snapshot of a moment in time, and it tells you where you are in terms of accessibility. And I would even be more specific than that in terms of the web content accessibility guidelines. So it's really valuable to say, this is the snapshot that we have, and here's how we're moving forward from it. Kind of similarly, sometimes we do see that there are issues in a VPAT where there are issues documented that are not under your direct control. Maybe there are issues that are coming from third party content or a plugin. And with those, that proactive conversation looks like we're actively reaching out to this vendor to try and get these addressed at the source, or we're actively looking for a new vendor to provide this content, this functionality that is going to meet the requirements. So again, having that proactive plan in place helps frame that conversation around the VPAT, and then actually following that plan is then going to make your VPAT reporting and your accessibility stronger over time. So those are great exercises to do, and then following them along is going to improve your accessibility and get you further along in that process.
You covered a lot of ground there. Couldn't agree more. I like that you were talking about how it's a snapshot of where you're at right now.
Hmm.
And I feel like pointing something that comes up a lot in my conversations when I'm speaking pretty candidly and like honestly with clients, as we tend to do here at Accessible Web, we just keep it real. Um, Honestly, a lot of the times having an imperfect, again in air quotes, VPAT, I find um, speaks volumes for anyone who's looking at your VPAT and knows what they're talking about. If anyone who really knows accessibility shows up and sees you have a perfect VPAT, especially on your first go, it's usually going to raise some red flags, right? It's like, okay,
Hmm.
well, who made this? Did you do this internally? And like, how valid is this? Which is why it's really important to get yeah, someone in the chat just said perfect VPAT is the definite red flag to me. I couldn't agree more. Um, and that's where like my second point on this is having a paper trail of imperfect VPATs is huge. Because you could eventually, right? Depends on the level of complexity around the site, but putting
Hmm.
in the work and shifting left and learning how to code things accessible does mean that eventually it is possible to get there, to have a perfect everything's listed as supports VPAT, or um, what's the other term? Sorry, like not included. What's the what's the term? I already
Not
forgot.
applicable?
Thank you. Not applicable. Um, but yeah, you could absolutely get there, but it would be really nice to be able to show that evidence of like, yeah, we started this journey 2 years ago and we had a mess of tasks to do.
Yeah.
And our VPAT had a ton of not supports, does not, or sorry, does not support and partially supports. But we have a paper trail showing that we've had several audits and we've worked through remediation. And we can prove that like we're in a really, really solid state now. Again, even after a couple of years of doing remediation, if all you're doing is remediating, you're probably not going to have a good VPAT anyway, because those tasks will have gone stale. You need a new audit and you've already released new content because you're updating your product. And if you haven't been shifting left along the way and learning how to build it in an accessible manner in the first go around, um, you're likely going to have mistakes again, just hopefully fewer and fewer. Which is why it's
Yeah.
really important to think about like we've said it time and time again, progress over perfection. Where again, a VPAT, a perfect VPAT, especially if you're a newer site or it's like your first time even thinking about accessibility and you're showing off a perfect VPAT, huge red flag. But being honest with where you're at is very crucial. And I feel like I know there's a note here that, and I'm gonna steal it from you, Kelsie, but I like this one and it goes hand in hand here. I'll let you speak to it, but if you could talk more about like the importance of when clients, if they do any of their own testing or if they have any people submit any of their findings, how important it is because that you're being honest because then if they do testing, they won't find their own surprises.
Yeah, 100%. And that's definitely one like I think here we really at Accessible Web, we really pride ourselves on being ethical and complete and transparent in VPATs that we create. If we put our name on it, we want to be able to stand behind those results. That, we did our best, we did our due diligence, we did manual testing. Um, and so that's a big part of it. And you don't want to be like, kind of if there's strategies or things that are kind of, yeah, hiding issues or like, we're just going to exclude this from the scope of our reports. We don't have to put this in the report. And then, right, you may have clients that are doing their own testing or they have third parties do testing. And so those issues are going to come up. And so it's just better to be upfront about those rather than have them discover it and then distrust kind of the whole process or the whole report. And definitely for things like a report that shows that everything is conforming, I would definitely expect to see, notes and clear, pretty detailed documentation about what that evaluation involved to feel more confidence that it was a thorough and valid evaluation. But yeah, but definitely that's a bad. I can speak to that from kind of in a position I had before this one where I was on the client side where we were doing procurement of a software, asked about accessibility during that procurement phase, gathering information. They said, "Oh yeah, we had an audit a year ago, everything's solid." And I opened it up and immediately found multiple accessibility issues. Couldn't operate it at all with a keyboard alone. Like it was kind of just even the most initial basic test that I ran, just instantly failed. It was like, okay, so at what point? So it really made me question what they had told me, what that assessment was. It made it seem like anything they tell me about accessibility, I'm kind of not going to believe now.
Right.
So I've had that experience on that client customer procurement side. So definitely here, like we don't want your customers and clients to have that experience. Or like, right, the clients of the organizations that we work with, we want everything to be transparent and clear so that real measurable improvements can happen. Because at the end of the day is what's going to serve you best. It doesn't serve to have a report that's inaccurate and not transparent, because then that translates into users that face barriers, and there's no plan to address those barriers. Um, but along
I,
with that is that idea of having like those report mechanisms, because even this other piece of where a perfect VPAT or even the current VPAT, we still want to have those mechanisms for users to get in touch about accessibility issues, for reasons that one, things change over time. Two, the web content accessibility guidelines, they're a great foundation. They don't guarantee perfect accessibility. So even though notice we're saying perfect VPAT, we're not saying perfect accessibility, because WCAG does not guarantee that. It's got known gaps and issues. It's got recognized and self-reported gaps and issues. So it's really important to recognize, and that can be also that part of that conversation of the VPAT is a piece, but it's not the whole. It's not the whole landscape. It's not the whole pillar that you should be relying on to be like we're accessible and we're relying on this report to tell us we're accessible. It needs to be one of multiple strategies and multiple things that are going into creating an accessible experience for users.
I really like that you finished off by saying that. Not finished off. I know we're not done chatting, but ending it on that note, I feel like is I hope that sticks with everyone who's here today is having a solid VPAT does not mean that you're perfectly accessible, and that should not be where your journey ends. Another big step, because you're probably wondering, okay, well, if we I've done WCAG testing. We have a good VPAT. What else should we be keeping in mind? Um, Absolutely get some user testing in there. Have people in there that daily drive just different assistive technologies in different combinations. I say combinations, I mean browsers, assistive technologies, and operating systems, and devices, right? Like if you're on a computer versus a cell phone, like there's going to be differences in different combinations. But that's like a really tried and true way to get people in there and actually using it to make sure that it's working as expected and all the information that is being communicated visually is being communicated via other means, and also any input methods that if you're expecting users to use a mouse, um, that leaves out a giant chunk of people that are using keyboard only navigation or sip and puff devices or eye tracking. Um, so anyway, I really like that note around like the VPAT is not the end of the journey. It is a really solid snapshot. Obviously, WCAG is the best standard out there currently. I would say that. I think that 3.0, when they get there, is going to be even better. Um, but yeah, and I think it's a good segue into talking. We've been focusing a lot on like technicality around VPATs and partial reports and all that, but another really important thing around being open, and I know you mentioned this, Kelsie, but I want to hammer this one home as well, is being open around where you fall short in accessibility is really crucial to users who might run into barriers. If they're debating using your software or your website or anything like that, and they upfront know where they may run into a barrier, it's less shocking when they do hit that barrier if they do, but it also allows them to know um, like if they need to get support, right? Like if they're using your software, you introduce a new feature, it's broken, and you have acknowledged that, it allows them to know, hey, I should contact them, let them know I'm reaching or I'm running into this barrier, and could you support temporarily, but also having that timeline that Kelsey was talking about, like that outline for we plan to fix this. Because it can't just be, all right, we said there's a problem, let's just leave it now, leave it alone. It's we acknowledge there's an issue, and there could be barriers from that problem. But we do plan to fix it. It's on the horizon. We just have 400 other tasks to get through, and not in any particular order, which is something we talk about. Hey, where do we prioritize tasks? But we don't have to get into that whole thing today. But essentially, any remediation task that comes out of it or any issue listed on a VPAT means that there will be some sort of barrier presented at some point in time. It just
Hmm.
depends on the type of person, and their particular disability.
Yeah.
Um, so, yeah,
100%. Well, and if you know where your trouble spots are in terms of accessibility, that gives you a lot of insight in terms of like customer and user support as well. Like you can make sure like, hey, let's make sure our customer support teams are trained around this particular issue because they may get outreach about someone who can't access this feature because they're using a keyboard or because they're using a screen reader. Or you can even know like, hey, in the UI, like let's put like a helper phone number, helper text, like make sure it's close to this feature that someone can access it easily. And I want to be clear that that does not absolve you of fixing the barrier, but it does smooth the customer experience while the barrier fix is getting done, or like, while it's being developed or while it's being researched. And that, because, for users, they care about getting the job done. And if you make the information access available, if it's available to get support so they can do it, again, the ideal is we want people to do it independently on their own and not have to reach out to your support team. But if you know where your trouble spots are, you can have kind of some helps and some supports already in place or already trained, already ready to go. And that's going to then smooth that experience for your users and can give you really kind of valuable insights of maybe potential trouble spots that you can be prepared for.
absolutely. Um, Are there any things, Kelsey? I'm gonna read off a question that I've been eyeballing here. We've got some good ones in the Q&A. Let me know if there's anything that you had already prepped, like notes wise, that we should be covering before I jump into Q&A. Or am I good to just jump right into it, do you think?
Um, I think the one thing that I wanted to mention was about that another way to approach communicating or sharing a VPAT that isn't as conforming as you would want it to be is to pair that with other supporting documentation. So we talked a little bit about some of those concepts, but I think it can be really helpful to pair that VPAT document with other documents that are supporting your organization's maturity around accessibility in your plan. So some of the types of documents that you might pair with that would be like a letter of engagement. That's something that we provide to clients that we're working with on an ongoing basis to kind of talk about our partnership and our process and how we're supporting them to help show their commitment and investment to accessibility. A formal remediation roadmap that talks about, timelines and the different issues and sprints, right? Like the kind of your plans around addressing those issues. Having a documented user ticket process. So, kind of what we were talking about, if you do learn about a barrier from a user, what's the process that's in place in order to, one, make an accommodation or provide the service or information, and then turn around and also work to address the barrier in the digital content itself. And any other documentation around your accessibility maturity model, like the steps that you're taking to become more accessible as an organization. And those can also be really valuable documents and information to provide alongside your VPAT. So that was my one thing I wanted to talk about, and maybe there's questions about it already. But anyway, we're good to jump into questions if we want. I just want to make sure to talk about that specifically.
Thank you. No, I appreciate you hitting that note. It's super, super important, very valid. Goes hand in hand with what we were saying before around like VPAT isn't the only thing you should be leaning on. Um, I'm going to skip the first one and come back to it because I think that I'll have to think about that one a little bit because there are some good examples for everyone. It's just like what's an encouraging transformation you've seen in an organization that embraced transparency instead of striving for a perfect VPAT. And I have one in mind. I just want to think about how to frame that. I also want to make sure I'm mentally prepping to not drop names of anybody. Um, but the next one I think is pretty straightforward. Should a VPAT include remediation guidance for identified issues? No, it doesn't need to. It can. It just makes your VPAT lengthy. this goes alongside what Kelsie was just saying around adding additional documentation when presenting a VPAT. So, for example, um, if you have all of your remediation tasks in Ramp, our platform, and who you're sharing it with, you can give them access to the organization to look at the tasks, right? So you now have a VPAT that's more clean, that just shows the number of tasks and where they're located, um, and like what the barrier is. And then you can, again, depending on who you're giving this information to, you can provide them with those tasks, right? So you can let them know exactly what the remediation guidance is. But typically that won't be very helpful for the people receiving the VPAT. The people looking at the VPAT are usually people just looking to know what kind of barriers there are, how many barriers, and how severe are they. They're not the ones typically implementing the remediations. Um, what is a reasonable cost for a VPAT, particularly for GIS related content, and how often should I get a VPAT? So the cost for a VPAT is definitely going to vary. Our cost depends on the size of the scope of the project. So our rate is flat. So if you want to get a VPAT to create a VPAT, you have to have a whole page audited. And like a VPAT will be built off of however many pages you want included in there. So if you have a site that, let's say you have an e-commerce site, and you have a few main flows. So you have your checkout flow, your home, like your main screen, your account and settings pages. But most of the screens, you have 2,000 screens, but 1,990 of them are product listings, and they're all the same core content. We wouldn't have you audit every single one of those pages. That would be an insane amount of money and time. We would audit a representative sample. So we would look at different um, listings for different things that you're selling and make sure that all of the different, like if you have one that allows you to select the color, but another one allows you to do a custom embroidering, like an input field, we just want to get a representative sample on all of those. And for that, we charge $500 per screen of what's included in the VPAT. So it'll range just depending on the size of your project and platform and how many unique flows and screens there are. How often should you get a VPAT? I would say it is an annual thing. Having the same year or within a year date on your VPAT is very important. It doesn't always mean that it needs to be a brand new one. It could be updated over time if the core content isn't changing. You're just implementing remediations. However, we do see a lot of the time within a year in the big 2026. A lot of things can change. AI is being implemented now, but a lot of things in the tech industry, right, we're constantly trying to introduce new features, even at Accessible Web. But this is across the board in the online tech world. You're most likely going to be introducing new stuff, which means you'll need to get a new audit. If you haven't changed your content at all, I would say it's still nice to have someone go through at least every 1 to 2 years to verify that, make sure the content hasn't changed, which is where Ramp comes into play with our upcoming features, talking about new features where we take snapshots of where you were, of code and visually screen, so both code and screenshots of the page and store that so we can look back in a year and be like, how much has this page changed? So that'll vary. I would say if you're introducing new content regularly, you should be having that new content audited and getting that either added to that VPAT if it's the same product, or getting a new VPAT for it. But you should definitely at least be getting verification work done. I would say annually is a good rate to make sure that it doesn't go stale. If I went to a site, if a client asked what's a third party site that you'd recommend for adding a maps component, and I went to Google Maps and I saw that they had a VPAT from 2020, or even 2023 at this point, I'd be like, wow, that's outdated. I'm sure a lot has changed. And I don't think that this is an accurate reflection of where they're at currently. I've been talking a lot. Anything to add to that, Kelsie?
No, I think those are great points. Um, and I guess the other piece, just as another pro shift left, is that the more you're including accessibility in your design and development processes, then the fewer surprises you'll get during that audit cycle, whether that's every 1 to 2 years, that those things really go hand in hand to make your life easier when trying to make an accessible product.
Awesome. We've got a lot of questions here. I'm going to try and rip through a couple of these. Um, this first one is because we're approaching time here. If two vendors have equally imperfect VPATs, what signals tell you which organization is genuinely committed to accessibility? That's a great question. I know this one was asked earlier, so I think we have already answered. I think Kelsie answered this one, which is additional documentation and planning, right? If they have
Hmm.
actual timelines and schedules and can tell you, hey, we're working on this and here's how. Um, but what
I
other
would
thoughts
I
do you
would
have?
add user testing to that as well. Like that's often a big differentiator. So checking out the methodology, like a complete VPAT should give information about the methodology and the tools that were used. And if they conducted user testing as part of creating the VPAT, that should be documented in the VPAT. So that would also be a huge differentiator for me would be what tools, and particularly if user testing was formally part of the VPAT creation process.
Definitely. This next one is also a good question. Are there any requirements for companies to deliver VPATs on a routine or regular basis, timeline-wise? If not, how to receive the most recent VPAT that helps us with the content we're putting online. So that is just going to come down to individual agreements in most places. So if let's say there's a school who's using some sort of online software and the school is required to provide accessible content to their students. That means that that software would also be required to do so. And as part of fulfilling whatever contract they might have, they might say we need an annual renewal of a VPAT. But that is going to come down on a case-to-case basis most times. Next question. How thorough do you recommend the remarks to be for success criteria that partially support? In some cases, we could have more than 20 bugs. Should we mention them all? That's a fantastic question. We've talked about this over the years. I've been here almost 5 years now, and this is something that has come up and multiple different discussions around like, all right, well, who's looking at these and how much info should be in there? Um, I would say it doesn't have to be overly thorough where you're explaining the exact code in which the issue lives in. But if there are 20 bugs related to keyboard support on one screen or sorry, on any screen, but there's 20 accessibility issues that have been documented for just one success criteria, I would ensure that you have all 20 in there. Um, but it can be bulleted. That's typically how we structure it is it's bulleted unless it's the same component, right? If it's the same button, that's you can't activate it with keyboard, but it's on 20 different screens. I would say there is a component, there is a button that is non-keyboard operable across 20 different screens. Um, which again, if you have 1,000 screens, you may want to just list out those 20 screens. If your site is 20 screens, that will already be indicated in the VPAT. That's something we do. We list the number of screens. So if there's 20 items listed at the top, 20 screens, and we say it applies to 20 screens, safe to say it's on every page, and you don't really need to specify which ones. Um, but what do you think, Kelsie? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, no, I think I think it definitely is valid to communicate in the remarks in terms of like patterns and themes, especially around like we know there's a few success criteria that are quite broad in what the potential failures, 131 information and relationships and 412 name role value come to mind, that there's a lot of potential things that could fall under those categories. So with those, I'm definitely a big fan of kind of talking about the patterns of the types of issues and a sense of the scale, whether that's listing out number of screens or the specific screens where they're present. Again, trying to make it be a valid and valuable document, but not VPATs are really not intended, kind of like we've been talking about, they're not intended to necessarily spell out every single line item. But I like to think of it as I really, my goal is that if a user read this VPAT, they would have a sense of whether or not the issues would impact their particular accessibility needs. That's sort of what I try to think of as kind of like a guiding principle of how much detail, which means not necessarily a ton of technical detail, but an understanding of kind of the themes. Um, like headings are not coded correctly, or yeah, there's issues with keyboard. There's components that are not operable using keyboard, and that's kind of what I maybe, and that's less kind of focused, I think, on the compliance and maybe technical side. But that's how I think of like what level of details I want users to be able to understand how their needs are likely to be impacted by this while they're using this product.
Awesome. Thank you for elaborating more on that. I do know that a few people have left, and we did have someone ask in the chat directly to the host and panelists, for those who can't see it. Um, we are planning to get through these questions. The only reason I wanted to speed it up is because I know some people have to bounce hard at 2:30. Some people already have left. We are going to continue going through these. So again, as I said at the beginning, if you do have to jump, that's okay. This is all going to be recorded, so you can come back to it later. But for those wondering whether or not we're going to keep going, we will get through these questions. They're really, really solid. Not going to just leave them hanging. And thank you for asking them. Sweet. All right. This would be awesome. Thanks for joining. Take care, John. Um, awesome. For you, Kelsey, what's the difference between a VPAT and an ACR?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So ACR stands for Accessibility Conformance Report, and it is the broader category of just reports about accessibility conformance of a product. And the VPAT is a particular template. It's essentially a style of ACR. So it's sort of like ACR is the broader category, and VPAT is the specific template. So it's not VPATs have become kind of an industry standard of how we report and communicate about accessibility for a product, but unless it's contractually required that you supply a VPAT, VPATs are not the only way to report about your accessibility. But it's one where it's become so standard and familiar. It's the most common way of reporting on it, and it sort of has that set order of information and way of communicating about accessibility that has people have gotten more comfortable and kind of understand how to read or how to look at them. So while it's become super popular, it's not necessarily required in a lot of cases, and it's just one way of reporting on accessibility.
I think we should clip that one. We get that question a lot, and I think that you just described it perfectly. We should get that and put that on our channel as like a short or something and be able to share that. Um, awesome. This is a really good question as well. Should there be a VPAT for each product that's released to the market? Example given, web interface, iOS app, Android app. And the answer is yes. Each of those versions of the, even though at its core, I'm assuming it's the same content, run on different code. And that means that they are going to need to have different things kept in mind while they're being built. Um, and typically, just because they're on different platforms, you have different teams working on them, usually. It depends on the size of your company, but that means that people are going to build it in a different way. So even though one person may be able to keep those things in mind across each platform, if it is multiple teams, this is just another way, another layer, another way to make sure that everything is in good shape. And as I mentioned earlier, with like combinations around Android, typically people use TalkBack and any browser. I know a lot of Android's owned by Google, so a lot of times it's Google Chrome. And then on iPhone, it's VoiceOver. For iOS is a typical one because it's solid and it comes on the phone. And then Safari is a common browser. And then even if you're on a desktop, but you're on Windows versus Linux versus Mac, you're going to be using NVDA or JAWS or VoiceOver. And when I say VoiceOver, it's technically still different on Mac than it is on
Mhm.
iOS. So yes, you're going to want to make sure you get audits across each of your platforms, and then have VPATs or ECRs provided accordingly. Great question. And they said thank you and thank you for asking. Great question. Um, all right. How can you explain to a client we're supplying the VPAT from internal data that the fully perfect VPAT isn't a thing and we shouldn't be seen as inaccessible with an imperfect one? I would say this is a tough one. How would I explain that? It's easier to explain that as an accessibility company, I feel, right? Because in this case, it sounds like you might almost sound like you're defending yourself, which in this case, you would be doing that because you did it the right way. And
Mhm.
I feel like a safe way to do this might be to provide examples from other companies that have large accessibility teams like Amazon and Google. If you, and Shopify, I know Gianna dropped a link in there earlier as an example. It's in the chat where I feel like sharing examples of like, yeah, well, like Shopify has a big accessibility team. Why do they have partially supports? It's because they're doing honest reporting. Um, but that is going to be a tough situation if you're comparing your VPAT to a client's and theirs is listed as fully conforming. You could also go as far to, and I'm not saying start any beef with any other competitors you may have, but there are free scanning tools. If you're not an expert in accessibility yourself, you can grab a scanning tool such as ours. But again, there's a number of free scanning tools out there that just run against WCAG and whatever success criteria, or sorry, whatever level you select. Um, and you could run a scan and figure out, here we go, another one from Gianna. Almost every VPAT from Google also has, if not many, partially supported success criteria. So, yeah, you could also run a scan, and although then that's something else you could share, a little bit of expert knowledge. Most of the scanners out there are only going to catch, of the ones that aren't using AI, are going to catch about 25 to 30% of actual accessibility, or sorry, WCAG failures on a page. It's going to be even lower when you compare it to all accessibility failures. But yeah, I would do that, right? Because if you can prove, hey, they have a perfect VPAT, why did I find a contrast issue on their homepage? Might be a really good way to, or might be a good way to push them your way. But again, not trying to start beef. Um, awesome. They said that that's how they're
That's
planning to.
definitely a hard conversation to have with, right? Especially we're talking about like procurement and you're talking to a potential client or customer. And this is usually folks that probably don't know a lot about accessibility. A lot of people don't know a lot about accessibility and they know need to get a VPAT and they look at the VPAT and they just look at the evaluation column. And if they don't see supports all the way down, they're like, what is this? This is, like they don't have that context of understanding kind of necessarily like what it's looking at or, um, that larger understanding of VPATs and kind of what's typical for them. So I think it definitely can be useful potentially to kind of put it in context. Like there is a big difference between partially supports and does not support. And there's also a big difference between conformance issues in your core functional flow of your product versus like we have some issues that are in this kind of side functionality that's not critical to the core functionality and we're working on it but we prioritized our core functionality which is now conforming and we're hitting this next. So I think that can be one way to approach it is to try to contextualize a bit within the context of your product. Again, never downplaying that the issues don't matter because they do all matter. They are all a potential barrier, but that sometimes helping to provide that context can be useful for someone who doesn't maybe have a very nuanced understanding of reading VPATs or of accessibility in general. And at least for me, if I was reading a VPAT and then from a client that was also providing robust documentation about their processes and their roadmaps and things like that, I would see that as a really strong accessibility partner, even if their VPAT is not everything conforming in that evaluation column.
Awesome. I appreciate you elaborating. They said that this is the exact situation they're going through right now is the people they're talking to don't know accessibility that well. Um, For the person who asked that, I know that you asked anonymously and totally understand why, but if you do want to get in contact, just to have a conversation about this, we're more than happy to chat and provide a little bit of insight. Not saying you have to buy anything from us or anything like that. I know we have a salesperson on the call, maybe a few of them here. I'm not a salesperson, but if you're going through something like this, we're more than happy to give you a little bit of insight. So feel free to contact us if you want to do so privately to talk more about how to approach this. Um, and thank you again for being here and asking good questions. All right, last question here. This is the one that I held off on earlier because I need to think about it. And it's what's the most encouraging transformation you've seen in an organization that embraced transparency instead of striving for a perfect VPAT? And I'm thinking of a very particular group that we work with, a client of ours, and they make um, training, like they have a program for helping train people. And Kelsie, maybe you can figure out who I'm thinking about. Um, and I think what's really cool is that their first audit was actually it was pretty solid because they'd already been thinking about accessibility, but no one there was necessarily a pro. And it was the first time they'd gone through the audit process, and this was years ago. And when they got their results, they didn't panic, and they were like, "Okay, great." Like because some of this stuff is related to education, we are being told we have to provide our VPAT. We provided this VPAT that was not perfect, and they said, "Thank you for providing this. We still want to move forward with you. What's your plan?" And their plan was to learn how to implement accessibility internally. And I know that this all sounds like a made up story, but I just don't want to say their name. But it really is like the perfect story of their team of developers asked really good questions, got on a lot of calls with us, and then came up with multiple, like they read, here's the big one, I guess, the like encouraging transformation is they read beyond the what do I need to do and looked into the why do I need to do it. And that helped them find their own solutions that even we didn't recommend. We were like, here's our easiest recommendation, because a lot of the times those are the ones people want to go for. Like, all right, this is the simplest solution. And they're like, hey, instead of doing that, what if we just did this huge thing? And we're like, yeah, that would be even better. That's a huge lift, but you could totally do that. And they're like, yeah, we're going to do that. That's a way better experience for everybody. Um, and I remember being like, wow, these people, not only do they care, but they're taking it beyond the like, okay, I have to do this, and being like, okay, why am I doing this? Okay, this particular success criteria helps this person with this disability. So if I put myself in their shoes to the best of my ability, what would be the best experience and how can I make that happen? Um, awesome. So yeah, that group again, I don't want to name names, even though they're doing everything right. I don't know whether or not they would be comfortable with me saying the
Hmm.
name of their company. Um, but they have been an absolute pleasure to work with. Honestly, I've been working with them for almost my whole time here. I think shortly after I started here is when they signed up. And to see them grow has been really, really encouraging, because now they still, by the way, they still reach out for audits on new products. Um, and our findings are so minimal. Like we were talking about, it's hard to get a perfect VPAT, and that's totally true and still stands even with them. But it is wild to see like the things that they're thinking about um, ahead of time now. They're not doing it as a secondary thought.
Yeah, I think though, um, clients like that are so cool to work with. And I think one thing that really sets it apart is when they start to see and internalize, and I think they sort of had started from this position, is probably why they've been so successful, is that they see accessibility as a core part of their mission and of what they're doing and what they should be doing. And maybe some of that in this instance coming kind of from like a training type, right? Thinking about different learning styles, different learner, right? That molds and meshes very well with the concepts of accessibility, right? Everyone's coming to the content differently with different modalities, with different technologies, with different levels of understanding and background knowledge. And that fits in so well. And I think organizations that are successful in seeing accessibility as a core tenet of who they are and what they're trying to accomplish, really are you see them incorporate accessibility in so many ways, and they get so much less focused and kind of hung up on like conformance questions or like how their VPAT is going to look, because at the end of the day their core focus is, can people use this? And that really makes such a big difference in our conversations. And I think in their success in their success in the conformance has followed their dedication to it as a concept.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kelsie, and thank you so much, everyone who joined today. We have made it through our Q&A. Um, yeah, I think we're at a good place to wrap it up here. And for those who toughed it out the whole way through, honestly, it seemed like a majority of people who joined today are still with
I
us. So
warned Ben I
appreciate
was going
that.
to ramble if I didn't have slides, so that's my
We went into it.
excuse.
We went into it knowing it was possible. Awesome. Perfect. Well, thank you so much again, Kelsie. This was super insightful and helpful. And thank you, everybody, for keeping the conversation going with your great questions. And yeah, if you want to learn more about what we do here at Accessible Web, feel free to reach out. If you have any other questions you didn't feel comfortable asking today, feel free to reach out to us about those. I did see, I won't talk about the content, but for someone who did ask to have a private conversation, I did receive that, and I will be. Um, making note of that and following up. So thank you for reaching out, and thank you all for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Bye.